Erin Patterson has been found guilty of murder, and this was her weapon, a beef Wellington. I sat in court for most of the 8-week trial, and today I'm going to walk you through the evidence that saw her found guilty. My name is Guy Adams, and this is Evidence Box. This is a trial a case that is predominantly about mushrooms, and here in the evidence bag we have a mushroom. In this trial, the type of mushrooms that were at the centre of the case did not look like this. The type of mushrooms was a variety known as the death cap. You can see it here. Now there's a reason the person in that picture is wearing a blue glove, and that's because death cap mushrooms are incredibly poisonous. In fact, during the case we heard from a number of mushroom experts. This is a very important one in the context of the trial. He's a man called Tom May. His nickname is Funky Tom. Now he appeared in the witness box and told us exactly what happens if a human being ends up eating one of these mushrooms. And basically, over the course of about a week, all of your vital organs shut down and you are likely to eventually die. Your liver is probably the first thing and most important thing to go. Erin Patterson lived in Victoria, a state in southern Australia. She lived in a rural town called Leongatha, about 2 hours drive southeast of Melbourne. Now in that part of the world, death cap mushrooms tend to grow in the autumn, which is in the months of April and May when it's starting to get rainy. And they're quite rare, but they pop up underneath oak trees. Now the prosecution's case was that Erin Patterson deliberately sought out these quite rare and highly poisonous mushrooms in order to feed them to her guests at a lunch that took place in July 2023. The defence's case was that she definitely did feed her guests death cap mushrooms that day, but that this was an accident. The defence argued that Erin foraged for mushrooms, it was a sort of hobby, and that the whole thing was a terrible mistake, and she inadvertently thought that a mushroom that looks like that was edible, much like a mushroom that looks like this ought to be. Item number 2, the murder weapon. Coming back to that beef Wellington. Now, for those of you who don't know, the beef Wellington, I'd describe it as a staple dinner party dish. It's a whole fillet of beef wrapped in pastry and then baked in the oven. But importantly, and you'll see, I'm just about to pull it apart, in between the beef and the pastry, there is a layer of something called duxelle, which is a kind of reduced fried pate made out of mushrooms and garlic. And that is essentially how the poisonous mushrooms found their way into Erin Patterson's lunch. Now, at a normal dinner party, what you do is you slice your beef Wellington, and each guest will get a slice of beef Wellington on their plate, probably with a bit of gravy. On that fateful day in July 2023, Erin Patterson didn't actually make a beef Wellington. She made 5 of them. Each was a bit smaller than this one, and one individual beef Wellington was served to each of her 4 guests. Now those 4 guests were all relatives of her estranged husband Simon, with whom she had 2 children. They were Simon's parents, Don and Gail, his aunt Heather, and Heather's husband Ian, who was the local church pastor. 3 of those 4 guests died. The 4th, Ian, he survived, but he had to spend about a month in hospital, and he gave evidence at the trial about what happened when they went to lunch that day. It was an agreed fact that the beef Wellington did contain death cap mushrooms. The question for the jury was how they got there. The prosecution, of course, said it was deliberate. She wanted to kill her guests. Erin Patterson said it was all a bit of an accident. And specifically, she says that when she was cooking that duxelle on the morning of the lunch, it was a Saturday, she was in her kitchen and she was sort of tasting the dish as she cooked it, and she decided that it wasn't quite mushroomy enough. She'd used a box of just normal mushrooms from Woolworths, the local supermarket, and she said that in order to make it taste a bit stronger, a bit more mushroomy, she'd use some dried mushrooms, something that, you know the type that look a bit like this. And she said she kept a load of dried mushrooms in a Tupperware container in the cupboard in her kitchen. And we'll come back to this crucial bit of the evidence later. The next crucial bit of evidence involved plates. Now, when Ian Wilkinson gave evidence at the trial, he said that Erin Patterson had seemed a little odd on the day that they had the lunch. He said she didn't really want anyone else to come into the kitchen, and when she served the dish for everyone, she put a beef Wellington on their plate, she put some green beans, she put some mashed potato, and in evidence that made me think she was probably a pretty bad cook, she ladled out some gravy that she'd sort of bought in a packet and poured that on top. Ian said that each of the guests was served by Erin on a particular type of plate. He said it was a grey plate. Now that's important because Erin, according to Ian, did not eat her lunch off the grey plate. Erin ate her lunch off a plate that looks something like this, although Ian actually said it was slightly smaller than the grey plates. This was crucial. The prosecution claimed that the reason Erin used colour-coded plates was that her beef Wellington was not poisonous and that the ones she served her guests were poisonous. And the prosecution claimed that it was a sort of insurance tactic by Erin, a way of making sure that she didn't accidentally feed herself one of the 4 poisoned beef Wellingtons. Erin, when she gave evidence in her defence, actually claimed that Ian had got it wrong. She didn't call him a liar. He was quite a convincing witness in many ways, but she did say he was mistaken. She said she didn't own any grey plates and that she'd served everyone on completely different coloured plates, some black, some white, because she didn't actually own any that looked the same. It was one of the issues that the jury had to make a decision on and decide who was telling the truth. Another important piece of evidence, it involved the investigation into the lunch by the local public health authorities. When they realised that people had eaten death-packed mushrooms, their immediate concern was obviously to find out where on earth these had come from and to prevent anyone else from falling sick. So public health officials carried out a number of interviews with Erin, and that brings me to another piece of evidence. These are some shiitake mushrooms. They're dried Chinese mushrooms. Now, when Erin was asked by those public health officials where she'd got the mushrooms that she used in her lunch from, she'd said they came from 2 places. She said some of them had come from the local Woolworths, fresh mushrooms, and she then claimed that some of them had been dried mushrooms that she'd bought from an Asian supermarket. That caused a bit of a panic amongst public health officials. Obviously, if an Asian supermarket selling dried death-cap mushrooms, lots and lots of people could be about to die. So they were very, very keen to find the source of these mushrooms. But Erin Patterson said she couldn't remember where that supermarket had been. There was no record on her bank statements or card statements of any point of sale purchase in an Asian supermarket. Erin said, I must have paid cash. She gave a sort of rough neighbourhood she couldn't quite remember. Public health officials went to a number of shops trying to find mushrooms with the sort of description Erin gave. They couldn't find them. And it was only in court that Erin changed this evidence somewhat. She said, yes, I did have a Tupperware container full of dried mushrooms from an Asian supermarket in my kitchen that was added to the duxelle as I was cooking. But, she said, I'd also put in that Tupperware container some of the mushrooms I'd foraged and then dried out, and they must have all got a bit mixed up, and that's how my guests were poisoned. I now want to talk about another piece of food, in this case a cake, or more specifically, an orange cake. Now, the reason I want to do this is quite simple. A lot of the trial revolved around the question of how 3 of Erin's 4 guests died, and one of them very nearly died, when Erin didn't. Now, the prosecution's case, of course, as we know, is that Erin had made sure that her beef Wellington didn't have any death-cap mushrooms in it. The defence's case was a little more convoluted. Now, Erin said she basically cleared things up. She went around the room and at some point she chanced upon an orange cake. It had been made by Heather Wilkinson, one of the guests. Because everyone's beef Wellington was quite large, not very much of this orange cake had been eaten. But Erin looked at it and says she suddenly felt quite hungry. Now, at this stage in her evidence, Erin told the jury something which she'd never told anyone in her life before. She said that she'd been struggling with body image issues from quite early on in her life, and that for most of the last 20 or 30 years, she'd actually been suffering from bulimia. And when she was asked about this by her barrister, Colin Mandy, he said, well, how does this manifest itself? And like all bulimia, you eat too much of something and then you make yourself sick. Erin said that she saw this cake and she ate a slice of it. And then she was asked, what did you do next? And she said, well, I ate another slice and another slice and then another until I'd eaten the whole cake. At this point, Erin was asked what had happened after that. And she claimed that she then went to the bathroom and made herself sick. Now, it's the defence's case that in making herself sick, Erin must have vomited up quite a lot of that lunch. and probably most of the beef Wellington, and that this explains why, although they claim she was a little bit sick, she wasn't as sick as the others. This brings me to the next item of evidence, some toilet roll and a poo bag. Now, we heard in court that all 4 of Erin's guests started to feel really ill on the Saturday night after the lunch. About 10 o'clock at night, they were vomiting, they had pretty severe diarrhea, and by the Sunday morning, all 4 of them, and remember they were quite elderly, they'd all been taken to hospital. Erin, in her evidence, claimed that she too was sick, and that she too had started to suffer from diarrhea on the Saturday night, and that this was pretty severe and it continued for more than 24 hours. The defence was sceptical about this, and so we got into all sorts of quite grisly evidence about the details of Erin's diarrhea, the consistency of her poo, and there was one quite bizarre incident that was raked over several times in court, when Erin had said that on the Sunday night, so 24 hours after the lunch, she'd driven her son to a flying lesson. He took flying lessons, and the flying school was about 90 minutes away. Now, the prosecution said, look, how did you drive 90 minutes when you had such explosive diarrhea that you claimed to be going to the toilet every 20 minutes? And Erin said in her evidence that actually her diarrhea was so bad that she was forced to stop by the side of the road, waddle off into the bush, and do what those of us who are into camping know as a wild poo. She said she then cleaned herself up with some wet wipes and toilet roll she had in the car and put them in a dog poo bag that she disposed of at a petrol station later in the journey. She also claimed to have gone to the toilet in the petrol station, although the CCTV from that petrol station showed that she was only in there for about 9 seconds. Erin's case was that she was very, very sick, and on the Monday morning she went to hospital. Having presented there, she then decided to pop home again. She said she had to deal with her animals. She had dogs, she had sheep at home. Then she returned to the hospital and they ran a number of tests. The doctors concluded once they'd run her bloods that actually she wasn't that ill, and she checked out of hospital on the Wednesday. And again, this was something the jury had to think about. They had to work out whether, as the defence said, Erin was sick, but not as sick as her guests, or whether, as the prosecution contended, she was making the whole thing up. The next item of evidence, medical records. Erin Patterson didn't usually entertain people at her house. It was very rare, and in fact, Ian and Heather Wilkinson had never been to her house. The reason she invited them to the lunch involved her medical condition that she claimed to have been suffering for some time. Now, Erin had told her relatives that she had found a lump on her elbow, and several weeks before the lunch that she'd gone to a local hospital where they performed a needle biopsy and a scan to try and work out what this lump was. She exchanged text messages with Gail, her mother-in-law, and in those text messages Gail had asked her how the tests had gone, and Erin had said, not bad, but you know, there's a bit to unpack here and I want to tell you all about it at the lunch we're going to have. She also exchanged text messages with her estranged husband Simon, who she'd also invited to the lunch. Now, he decided not to go at the last minute. When he decided that the night before, Erin sent him a quite angry message saying, given the conditions, my medical conditions, this is likely to be the last chance I have to have an event like this for some time, and I'd really like you to attend. In court, it emerged, according to Ian Wilkinson, towards the end of the lunch, Erin had said she had an announcement to make, and she told her guests that she'd been diagnosed with cancer, specifically with ovarian cancer. When police began investigating the lunch, they of course pulled Erin's medical records, and they discovered in those medical records no evidence at all that she'd been suffering from cancer. She'd never been diagnosed with cancer. She'd never had tests on a lump on her elbow. She'd never had scans. There'd been no needle biopsy. The whole thing was a lie. Now, the prosecution's case is that Erin told this lie for a simple reason. They say she wanted to ensure that all of her guests came to the lunch because she was plotting to kill them all. Also, she wanted to make sure that her 2 children were not there and that it didn't seem odd that they weren't there. So the guests and the children were told that the grown-ups had to talk about grown-up stuff. The adults were told that we need to have a sort of proper conversation. Now, when Erin was asked about this, when she gave evidence, she said something very different. Erin said that she'd actually been suffering, as we know, from body image issues, and she was really concerned about her weight. And that sometime in 2023, she decided it was time to get gastric band surgery. Now, Erin claimed she'd actually booked in for this surgery. And because it's quite a major procedure, she knew that in the days after the operation, she was going to need a bit of help with childcare. She didn't really want to tell everyone that she was having gastric band surgery because she was, in her words, embarrassed about it. So she cooked up the story about having cancer as what you might call a sort of white lie. Now, she was cross-examined about this by the prosecution barrister, Nanette Rogers, and asked, well, where was this gastric band surgery going to happen? Was it booked? In the witness box, Erin turned around and said, yes, I'd booked it for a day in September at a clinic in Melbourne called the Enrich Clinic. I was sitting in court at the time and I got my laptop out and I Googled the Enrich Clinic. I was fascinated by it. I'd never heard about it. It was a new piece of evidence. And it very soon became clear to me that this Enrich Clinic, it's a sort of cosmetic dermatology clinic. And I could find no evidence whatsoever that it performed gastric band surgery. Now, it looks like the prosecution did something very similar because a day later, Nanette Rogers raised this issue and said they'd gone to the Enrich Clinic, they'd taken evidence from the people who ran it and said to Erin Patterson, we've done our homework and we've discovered this place you said you were going to have gastric band surgery doesn't actually do gastric band surgery. Erin looked a bit surprised. She ummed and ahed. It wasn't a great moment for her in the witness box. She eventually said, oh, well, maybe I was wrong, maybe I was, confused, maybe I meant liposuction, something like that. In addition to admitting to lying to her own family about having cancer, she was also lying to the jury in the room on that day. And I think that may very well have sealed her fate. The next thing to come out of the box is a tablet. Police raided Erin Patterson's home twice. During those searches, they seized a huge number of devices. And on those devices, they found some quite interesting material. First thing they found was a lot of messages that Erin had exchanged with Facebook friends. She was a member of a true crime forum. She became quite friendly with the members of that forum, and during lockdown they sort of splintered off into little groups and they began talking about, their lives. Now, Erin Patterson around this time, around sort of late 2022, had fallen out quite badly with Simon, her estranged husband. She and Simon separated in 2015, and for years things had been pretty amicable. They'd shared sort of parenting duties, their finances had been casually organised. Erin was actually quite a wealthy lady. She'd inherited an awful lot of money from her grandmother and then her mother, who died in around 2019. And she'd been very generous with the money. She'd loaned cash to members of Simon's family. At the end of 2022, Simon had put on his tax return that he was single. He'd previously been saying he was married, although they were living apart. And by saying he was single, Simon, which he said when he gave evidence, he sort of did accidentally, didn't really think about it. By saying that had severe implications for Erin and her tax status, and it meant that she couldn't claim certain tax breaks and she was significantly poorer, and she was very upset about this. She contacted child support and said, look, if you're going to say, if you want to be single, we need to we need to organise our finances. And child support became involved, and they started arguing over who would pay the kids' medical fees, who would pay the school fees, how much money they should each have to live off, whose name should be on the deeds to all the properties they owned. And it became, for a time, quite a kind of heated argument. Their relationship deteriorated, and in late 2022, Erin had asked Simon's parents if they could get involved, maybe mediate, and Simon's parents had basically said, look, we don't feel comfortable doing that. All we can advise is that you two, work it out, maybe get together and pray together. And Erin had vented about this in considerable detail on some of these Facebook groups. So the messages they actually retrieved, messages she sent to her friends saying, I'm sick of this shit. I want nothing to do with them, meaning her in-laws. So fuck them. Another message says, this family, I swear to fucking God. In the context of the trial, this was important. The defence and Erin right from the start of the case, had always maintained she loved her in-laws. She was friendly to Simon. She didn't want to harm him or his family, and she was very upset that they'd died. This was just, words she exchanged in the heat of the moment and should be seen in that context. The prosecution's case, on the other hand, was that while she pretended to get on well with her in-laws, she actually really had fallen out with them quite badly, and that her real feelings towards her family, the ones that motivated the crime, were the feelings she expressed in these Facebook messages to her friends. The other important role that phones and tablets played in the trial involved triangulation evidence. So a mobile phone, when you use it, connects to a mobile phone mast. Your mobile phone, the one you carry around, is constantly searching for the best mast to get the best signal. So when you forensically examine them, experts are sometimes able to sort of work out where you were at any given moment. They can't do it with complete certainty. It doesn't quite work if you're underground or around hills or tall buildings. It can be a bit quirky, but they can draw a pretty good picture of where someone is and when. And using that evidence, they discovered that Erin Patterson had made 2 peculiar journeys to towns about half an hour, 45 minutes from Leongatha, where she lived. Those towns were called Loch and Outram. And that's significant because, as I mentioned before, death cap mushrooms aren't very common in the state of Victoria. But Erin turned out, according to analysis of her computers, turned out to be a pretty avid user of an internet site called iNaturalist. Now, it's a sort of citizen science website where people log sightings of interesting plants. Sightings had been logged on iNaturalist of death cap mushrooms in those towns. One of the people who'd actually logged one of the sightings was Tom May, the mushroom expert, Funky Tom. That was his username on iNaturalist. He'd logged a sighting of mushrooms, and on that very day, or the day after, Erin Patterson went to the town where that sighting had been and spent about an hour there. The prosecution's case was that this showed that she was deliberately trying to pick death cap mushrooms. Erin's defence was that she might have gone to the town on that day. She couldn't really remember, but if she did, it was nothing to do with mushrooms. The other crucial piece of evidence involving devices revolves around a potential cover-up. Erin used a number of different mobile phones, and it emerged during the trial that although police had seized several of them, there was one, probably the one she used the most in the run-up to the lunch, that they never found. The handset they did seize, which had been one she'd used over the previous couple of years, Erin had managed to wipe. Specifically, during the time the police were searching the house, she turned to a detective and said, "Look, I've got my children, I need to arrange some childcare, my daughter needs picking up. Do you mind if I go and make a call?" And for whatever reason, the detective said fine, and she went off into another room in her house and she carried out a factory reset of her phone, completely wiped it. The prosecution's case was that this was important. This was evidence that Erin was orchestrating a cover-up because she knew she'd committed a crime and she thought there'd be evidence on her devices. Her defence was that no, she'd simply panicked and she was concerned, she was worried about the police searching her house, and it was the sort of thing someone does when they panic. The next piece of evidence is actually too big to fit into the box. It's down here, and it is a culinary device known as a food dehydrator. As I've mentioned, death cap mushrooms grow in Victoria in March or April, and yet the lunch at which 3 of her guests died was in July. And as you and I both know, you can't stick a mushroom in the fridge and expect it to still be there in July. What Erin Patterson did, and in fact she did this on the very day that she travelled to Loch, she went to a local hardware store at the end of April and purchased a food dehydrator. The one she bought was made by a company called Sunbeam. And over the ensuing months, she seems to have become quite interested in dehydrating mushrooms. She would cut up mushrooms she'd bought from the supermarket and dry them out. She posted pictures to her Facebook group of herself drying out mushrooms. And she told her Facebook friends that actually what she was doing was that her children didn't really like mushrooms. She thought they were very nutritious, very good for you. And so she'd dry out these mushrooms, grind them into a powder, and sprinkle the powder in her daughter's muffins. And this was a way of getting good nutrients into her daughter's otherwise poor diet. So here are 2 of the messages she sent about the mushroom dehydrator to her Facebook friends. So, fun fact, the Dehydrator reduces mushroom mass by 90%. Do you think Woolies would mind if I bought the Dehydrator into their vegetables section and dry things before I buy them? That's an Erin Patterson joke. The second message says, I've been hiding powdered mushrooms in everything. Mixed it into the chocolate brownies yesterday. The kids had no idea. The jury was actually shown images that they'd found on Erin's Samsung tablet of her food dehydrator with mushrooms in it. And actually the shelves of the dehydrator with mushrooms in them, they had scales on. She seemed to be weighing them. And they were taken, I think, in early May 2023. Now those photographs were shown to Tom May, Funky Tom, the mushroom expert. And looking at the mushrooms in those pictures, he said with I think his words were a high degree of certainty that the mushrooms Erin was drying out that day were death cap mushrooms. Now the prosecution's case, given that there were scales, was that Erin was sort of weighing out a lethal dose of these mushrooms, which she was then going to grind into powder. The prosecution was of the view and wanted the jury to be of the view that Erin had ground these mushrooms down into powder and that she'd used the powder as a sort of concentrated poison, much like she'd been able to sprinkle field mushrooms, dried field mushrooms, into her daughter's brownies. She could also sprinkle dried death cap mushrooms into her guests' beef Wellingtons. The prosecution claimed that when she put dried mushrooms in her children's food, Erin was sort of practicing for the murder she intended to carry out several months later. Although it's slightly unclear how these found their way into the beef Wellingtons, Erin did talk a bit about making the beef Wellingtons, and she said in court that she'd been unable to buy a whole beef fillet in the Woolworths in her town, as it happens, and so she'd instead bought sort of slices of beef fillet sort of wrapped in plastic. She'd bought 6 of them, I think, in total. The prosecution pointed out that they thought this was a bit unlikely, that she'd had to adapt the recipe in the recipe book she used because she'd not been able to find a whole beef Wellington. The prosecution said, well, why didn't you just go to the local butchers? Why didn't you shop around? Why didn't you try and find an entire beef fillet? Erin never really came up with a convincing argument for that either. It's one of the small things that helped seal her fate. Erin Patterson stayed in hospital until the Wednesday of the week after the lunch, and then they discharged her. She was fine. Everyone else was getting very sick indeed. They'd been transferred to hospitals in Melbourne, and 3 of the 4 people who had been at her lunch would die in hospital. And this brings me to my final piece of evidence. Well, this is a CCTV tape, a videotape. After being released from hospital or discharged from hospital on the Wednesday after the lunch, one of the very first things that Erin Patterson did, and it's an odd thing, is that she went to her local tip. And at that local tip, she took the food dehydrator that had been used, as we know, to dehydrate death cap mushrooms, and she disposed of it at the local tip. And the jury was shown CCTV of her doing that. The prosecution claimed, of course, that this was a weird attempt by Erin to cover up evidence, that the food dehydrator was a crucial piece of evidence that would prove that she'd poisoned her guests, and she wanted to get rid of it. And in her defence, Erin came up with a different claim. Erin said that while she'd been in hospital, she'd had a long conversation with her estranged husband, Simon, and during that conversation, they'd started talking about mushrooms, and actually started talking about dehydrated mushrooms and powdered mushrooms that she'd been feeding the children. Erin said that during that conversation, Simon had turned to her and said, "Powdered mushrooms, is that what you used to kill my parents?" Erin says that when Simon said that, she'd panicked. She had thought, crikey, he thinks I've murdered them. Social services were by then involved. They were talking about what to do with the children. And Erin says she panicked, and in that panic decided to dispose of the food dehydrator. It was silly, it was a terrible mistake, but that's kind of what she did. Now, Simon Patterson denied that any such conversation had taken place. His evidence was that it hadn't. And it was for the jury to decide who was telling the truth. But even if that conversation had happened, it seemed a bit, to my mind, sitting in court, it seemed very suspicious. So when the police went to the tip, they retrieved the food dehydrator and they took it for forensic analysis. And I mean, they needed to be sure that it wasn't someone else's dehydrator, of course, that had just coincidentally been dumped there. But they found on it a number of fingerprints, and those fingerprints were found to belong to Erin Patterson. And then when they subjected the food dehydrator to further analysis, they found death cap mushroom toxins on the shelves. I felt, sitting in court, that this was another really compelling piece of evidence, and it looks like the jury agreed. It's obviously a very unusual case, a very strange way to murder people, but adding to the surreal nature of this trial was the fact, although the eyes of the world were on court, there were 30 or 40 journalists there every single day, and lots of TV crews loitering outside. The trial wasn't happening in some big metropolitan court in Melbourne. It was in fact happening instead in a tiny little mining town near to Erin's home called Morwell. Erin had specifically asked to have her case heard locally. I think she felt that maybe a kind of jury made up of country people, local people, might be more inclined to believe her. And perhaps she also thought that if she is going to go to prison for 30 or 40 years, maybe this would be a sort of last chance to be in the kind of community that she lived in. It meant that the trial was heard in a really small room. There was room for only kind of 30 or 40 people in there, seats for 4 journalists at any one time. We all had to take part in a ballot to be in the room. Lots of locals were queuing up from dawn to be in there as well. It was quite compelling. At the start of the trial, the judge had to tell the jurors, look, you're probably going to end up bumping into lawyers, barristers, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. As you pop out for lunch, you might see members of the press, you might see people who are in court. Don't talk to them, and they're not going to talk to you, but don't think it's because they're being rude. That's just the rules. That's how a trial is conducted. You, the jurors, have to just reach your decision based on the evidence you've heard in court. This was a case where there was no one piece of what I'd say is kind of killer evidence. There was no one item that definitively proved Erin Patterson's guilt, but there were lots of little things, and added together, it was like a sort of jigsaw. When you put all the pieces together, you get a clear picture, and in my mind, she is clearly a very clever, calculating woman, and clearly a murderer. I think what sealed it for me really was seeing her on the stand. In any trial, the prosecution goes first. You hear their evidence. It took several weeks. And then it came time for the defence's evidence. And I was kind of thinking, well, what is the defense case? How can she explain lying about having cancer? How does she explain buying a food dehydrator, going to those places where the mushrooms were growing, looking them up on the iNaturalist website, drying out the mushrooms, making individual beef Wellingtons rather than one big one? What about her not getting as sick as her guests? How is she going to explain all of that? And I eventually realised the only person who could speak to any parts of her case was Erin herself, and therefore that it was going to be inevitable that she would have to go into the witness box. And I think she spent 8 or 9 days there. The first sort of 3 or 4 of them saw her being kind of cross-examined by her counsel, Colin Mandy, for the defence. She looked quite comfortable. In fact, she came across quite well. But as soon as the prosecutor, Nanette Rogers, got her on the stand and started really kind of picking apart some of the things she said, interrogating her, asking her to explain things that didn't quite add up, we saw Erin sort of being caught up in I suppose what I'd call a web of lies. She'd had to admit that she'd lied to her family about having cancer. She had to admit that she'd lied to the police about the food dehydrator, that she'd secretly tried to dump it. She had to admit that there was something didn't quite add up about the Asian supermarket. And eventually she came across really as someone who was just a bit too shifty. And when it emerged that she'd also lied about gastric band surgery, and that the clinic she said she was going to for the surgery just didn't do that kind of thing, at that point I think something broke in the jury, and you saw them exhaling quite deeply, and I thought at that point her goose was probably cooked, and so it proved. Now you've heard all the most important pieces of evidence, and perhaps you understand why the jury found Erin Patterson guilty. If you'd like to find out more, you can listen to our award-winning podcast, The Trial of Erin Patterson, wherever you get your podcasts. You can read my coverage, links below. And now it's time to close the evidence box. This has been the Mushroom Murder Case, the trial of Erin Patterson.